Edith Rockefeller McCormick did not lose her fortune in public. She lost it quietly in a boardroom through papers she was told were routine. The power was taken while trust was assumed, and no one raised their voice. The woman was Edith Rockefeller McCormick, daughter of the most powerful fortune in America. The injustice was not disinheritance, but the legal removal of her authority over wealth that still bore her name. Control passed to trustees and estate council acting under the language of governance, not family conflict. On November 15, 1917, a trust instrument and voting control agreement were presented as administrative formalities. This video will show how a transfer of power of this magnitude occurred without scandal, without headlines, and without resistance. By 1917, the Rockefeller name no longer needed to prove itself. It functioned as a symbol of permanence in American life, reinforced by philanthropy, institutional presence, and a carefully maintained public image. Newspapers spoke of stability. Universities bore the family's imprint. Foundations expanded. To the public, the fortune appeared settled, orderly, and beyond internal dispute. But stability in print often concealed negotiation behind closed doors. On November 15, 1917, inside the boardroom at 26 Broadway in Lower Manhattan, a different version of order was being enacted. The building itself was not merely an office. It was a headquarters of authority, associated with Standard Oil's legacy and the administrative machinery that had outlived the trust's formal dissolution years earlier. Decisions made there did not resemble family arguments. They resembled governance. Edith Rockefeller McCormick entered this structure not as an outsider, but as a beneficiary whose position appeared secure. Her name remained attached to wealth, trusts, and inheritance. Publicly, nothing suggested removal or exclusion. There were no court challenges announced, no social pages hinting at rupture, no editorials questioning her standing within the dynasty. What occurred instead was procedural. In the years surrounding the First World War, American finance was undergoing quiet consolidation. The war economy increased scrutiny of large fortunes, while progressive era reforms expanded the language of fiduciary responsibility. Trusteeship became a moral shield. Control could be justified as protection. Intervention could be framed as prudence. Authority no longer required overt confrontation when documentation could accomplish the same result. Within that environment, instruments of trust and voting control carried extraordinary weight. They did not announce dispossession. They reorganized it. A beneficiary could remain entitled to income while being structurally removed from decision-making, appointments, and strategic direction. Power did not vanish. It relocated. The press did not follow these shifts closely. There was little reason to. Foundations continued to operate. Donations continued to flow. The Rockefeller reputation, carefully cultivated, absorbed no visible damage. From the outside, inheritance appeared intact. From the inside, authority had been recalibrated. This tension between public continuity and private reallocation defines the mystery at the center of this story. How does control change hands without visible conflict? How does a person remain legally included while functionally excluded? And how does governance language replace the need for consent? The era provided cover. In 1917, attention was elsewhere. War dominated headlines. Industrial output and national loyalty consumed public discourse. Administrative decisions made in corporate boardrooms did not attract scrutiny unless they failed. Silence was not accidental, it was structural. What matters here is not a dramatic confrontation or an emotional collapse. It is the moment when a signature is requested as routine, when documentation is framed as protection, and when authority is transferred without the appearance of force. These are the mechanics that rarely enter historical memory, precisely because they leave no spectacle behind. The Rockefeller fortune did not fracture in public view. It reorganized itself quietly, relying on trust law, fiduciary language, and institutional legitimacy. What remained visible was continuity. What changed was command. If this transfer seems invisible, that is because it was designed to be. If access to a boardroom ledger or a sealed trust file can alter a legacy without debate, consider following beyond the golden halls to examine the records that history chose not to display, and register your response with a measured like. The door closes, the papers are filed, and one room at 26 Broadway is left behind, locked, orderly, and silent. On December 7, 1917, the first trace appeared where no one was supposed to be looking. It did not arrive as a dramatic filing, a stamped declaration, or a public notice. It surfaced instead in the margins of administrative order, embedded in the quiet logic of indexing at the New York County Clerk's office. A clerk's cross-reference, secondary, procedural, and easily overlooked, pointed to a voting trust, irrevocable trust, attached by annex number to a larger set of estate materials that otherwise spoke the language of inheritance. The document was not presented as a centerpiece. It did not sit where a will would sit, or where a transfer of title would normally be found. It existed as a numbered attachment, referenced only through page chains and index cues that assumed familiarity with internal filing conventions. In the public-facing narrative, nothing had changed. Edith Rockefeller McCormick remained a beneficiary. Her name remained intact, income streams remained visible, the family reputation, carefully managed, remained unchallenged, yet the paper trail told a different story. The index entry did not describe inheritance, it described control architecture. The language was technical, stripped of sentiment, and unmistakably permanent. Voting authority was reassigned, decision-making capacity was removed, powers that ordinarily follow ownership were restricted, then relocated. The trust was characterized as irrevocable, a term that does not invite future revision or consent. Whoever had drafted it did not intend it to be temporary, nor to be revisited through familial negotiation. What made the trace significant was not its existence alone, but its placement. Documents that merely manage assets tend to be centralized, visible, and cross-referenced by name. Documents that reassign power without public conflict tend to be buried. This one was buried deliberately. It appeared only to those who followed annex numeration forward and backward, tracing page sequences that did not resolve cleanly. The record did not announce itself. It waited to be noticed. Access to this material was limited by design. Trustees had access. Estate council had access. A narrow circle of administrators operating under fiduciary authority could view the complete structure. The beneficiary could not. Edith Rockefeller McCormick did not need to be informed in full for the mechanism to function. The trust did not require her approval to be effective. It required only procedural completion. The action of power here was a mission paired with reassignment. Authority was removed from one party and reassigned to a collective that answered only to itself. The consequence was immediate and structural. Decisions about appointments, strategy, and long-term direction were no longer hers to make. She remained associated with the fortune in name, but not in command. In legal terms, she was preserved. In functional terms, she was displaced. This trace should not have existed if the public story were accurate. Inheritance does not require a voting trust to neutralize an heir. Families that intend continuity do not convert personal authority into permanent governance without cause. The presence of this document contradicted the surface narrative without openly challenging it. It did not provoke scandal, it prevented it. The discovery mattered because it revealed intent. Someone anticipated conflict, exposure, or resistance, and designed around it. Someone chose structure over consent. The trust did not solve a problem that had already erupted. It prevented one from ever becoming visible. The index entry was not a reaction, it was preparation. In the administrative culture of 1917, this kind of maneuver carried little risk if executed correctly. The press did not audit annexes. Courts deferred to fiduciary language unless challenged, and beneficiaries who retained income were assumed to retain agency, even when the record said otherwise. Silence was not enforced by secrecy alone, but by complexity. The system rewarded those who understood where power truly lived. The real consequence extended beyond Edith Rockefeller McCormick herself. Once authority was centralized in trusteeship, it became insulated. Decisions could be made without personal accountability. Governance replaced relationship. Control could persist long after the individuals involved were gone. The trust did not merely manage wealth, it redefined who could speak for it. This is where the injustice sharpened. A fortune associated with family became a machine governed by documents. The beneficiary became a figurehead whose consent was no longer operational. The paper trail did not erase her name. It rendered it irrelevant. And because the trace lived in the index rather than the headline, no one protested. No correction was demanded. No public record contradicted the story of inheritance that continued to circulate. The takeover was not announced, it was filed. If inheritance were real, the records would read like succession. Instead, they read like containment. The question left behind was not whether power changed hands, but how often this method had already been used without notice. The index entry ends abruptly, pointing to annexes stored beyond the public counter, their pages aligned, numbered, and sealed into routine. Paper resting in a clerk's drawer, waiting for someone to follow the numbers where they lead. By May 15, 1911, the danger was already defined, even if it was never spoken aloud. On that date, the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of Standard Oil, breaking the most powerful corporate structure in American history into separate entities under the language of antitrust enforcement. Publicly, it was framed as a triumph of law over monopoly. Privately, it marked the beginning of a far more fragile phase for the Rockefeller empire, one in which reputation, legal coherence, and internal unity became as valuable as capital itself. The ruling did not destroy wealth, but it fractured visibility. Ownership was redistributed across successor companies, boards multiplied, and lines of authority blurred. What had once been a single, legible center of command became a constellation of interests tied together by agreements, understandings, and shared trusteeship. From that moment forward, any internal dispute risked becoming external evidence. Any family conflict could be interpreted as proof that the empire itself was unstable. For heirs, this environment was not neutral, it was hazardous. In the years following the dissolution, the Rockefeller name remained powerful, but it was no longer untouchable. Journalists tracked the reorganization closely. Reformers watched for signs of evasion. Competitors waited for weakness. Courts remained attentive to anything that suggested continued centralized control under another name. The family understood that governance had become a public performance and that even the appearance of internal disagreement could trigger renewed scrutiny. This is where Edith Rockefeller McCormick's position became uniquely exposed. As an individual heir with both visibility and standing, she represented a potential fault line. Any assertion of independent authority, any dispute over direction, control, or management would not remain private. It would be interpreted through the lens of 1911, when Standard Oil had been declared too powerful to exist as a single will. The action taken by the Rockefeller administrative apparatus during this period was not emotional suppression, but structural containment. Control was re-engineered to appear dispersed while remaining coordinated. Voting rights were restricted. Decision-making pathways were altered. Authority was reassigned from individuals to entities that spoke the language of fiduciary duty rather than personal interest. These were not symbolic gestures. They were legal recalibrations designed to withstand scrutiny. The consequence of this strategy was clear. No single family member could be seen as commanding the fortune. No heir could plausibly challenge governance without appearing reckless. Any dispute that reached the public domain would not be read as a family disagreement. It would be framed as evidence that the Rockefeller structure remained dangerously centralized or improperly managed. In that climate, silence was not merely preferred, it was required. For Edith Rockefeller McCormick, this meant that resistance carried disproportionate cost. A public challenge would not only jeopardize her own position, but risk reopening questions the family had spent years closing. Courts could be invited back into internal affairs. Newspapers could resurrect the language of monopoly. The careful post-1911 reconstruction of legitimacy could unravel. This is why the solution could not look like conflict. It had to look like administration. By converting personal authority into trust-based governance, the system removed the possibility of visible disagreement. Trustees could act without appearing to act. Counsel could restrict power while claiming protection. Control could be exercised. Without attribution, the beneficiary would remain financially intact, socially present, and legally recognized, while being functionally sidelined. The injustice here is not abstract. It is contextual and specific. The very reforms meant to limit corporate overreach created incentives to neutralize individual heirs. The environment made autonomy dangerous. It transformed disagreement into liability, and it rewarded those who could translate power into procedure. The public never saw this as coercion because it did not resemble coercion. There were no ultimatums, no court orders naming a victim, no headlines announcing exclusion. What existed instead was a quiet alignment between legal risk and administrative action. Power was not seized in defiance of the law. It was reorganized in anticipation of it. Standard Oil's dissolution did not end Rockefeller control. It changed its form, and in doing so, it narrowed the space in which an heir like Edith Rockefeller McCormick could safely operate. Her loss of authority was not the result of personal failure or public scandal. It was the outcome of a system designed to survive exposure by eliminating points of friction. This context matters because it explains why the injustice could proceed without resistance. Not because resistance was impossible, but because it was too costly to attempt. The risk was asymmetrical. The institution could absorb silence. The individual could not absorb publicity. And so the architecture of control and tightened, quietly justified by prudence and stability. What remained visible was unity. What disappeared was agency. The record does not show a confrontation, it shows preparation. And that preparation began the moment Standard Oil was declared too powerful to stand as one, leaving behind a legacy that could only endure by ensuring no single voice could challenge it. A legacy preserved in reorganized boards, restricted votes, and documents signed far from the public eye, resting now in files that still refuse to explain themselves. On February 3rd, 1918, the shift from preparation to intervention became explicit. The setting was Kikuit, the Rockefeller estate overlooking the Hudson River, chosen not for symbolism, but for control. It was a space insulated from press, courts, and public record, where governance could be discussed without creating a trail that invited interpretation. This was not a family gathering in the social sense. It was a closed meeting of patrimonial management, convened to resolve a problem that could no longer be handled indirectly. The problem was not wealth, it was authority. By early 1918, the post-Standard Oil environment had clarified its demands. Fragmentation could not be allowed to become visible. Disagreement could not surface as dispute, and beneficiaries could not be permitted to exercise autonomy in ways that produced unpredictable outcomes. What had previously been handled through dispersed trusteeship now required alignment. Someone had to decide, and that decision had to carry operational force. The records that survived this meeting do not describe debate, they describe direction. The language that appears later, embedded in correspondence, trustee memoranda, and standardized instructions, points to what was termed a protective direction. It was framed as preservation, not intervention, unity, not dominance, stability, not exclusion. But the effect was decisive. John D. Rockefeller Jr. emerged from this moment not merely as an heir with influence, but as the pivot of command. His role shifted from participant to coordinator. He did not replace trustees or counsel. He aligned them. Authority was not seized overtly, it was consolidated through instruction. Decisions that had once allowed for interpretation were standardized. Discretion was narrowed. Autonomy among beneficiaries was treated as a risk variable to be minimized. The action of power here was consolidation. Instructions were issued, formally in some cases, informally in others, directing trustees and estate council to operate under unified criteria. Voting behavior was to be consistent. Strategic decisions were to be centralized. Deviations were to be reviewed, delayed, or quietly neutralized. No single document announced this shift. Its existence is inferred through repetition. Identical language begins appearing across separate files. Similar constraints surface in unrelated decisions. What had once been flexible becomes uniform. The immediate consequence was structural. The Rockefeller fortune began functioning as an institution rather than a family inheritance. Authority no longer followed lineage or individual judgment. It followed protocol. Beneficiaries retained income and status, but their capacity to influence direction was restricted. Decisions moved upward and inward, away from visibility into a coordinated administrative core. For Edith Rockefeller McCormick, this intervention marked the point of no return. Whatever autonomy remained after the earlier trust arrangements was now effectively sealed. Her position was not revoked. It was contained. She could not challenge instructions without challenging the system itself, and the system had now been aligned behind a single operational center. The significance of February 3, 1918 lies not in what was said, but in what followed. After this date, the records change tone. Language becomes procedural. References to individual preference diminish. Trustees cease to justify decisions on a case-by-case basis. Instead, they refer to established standards, prior direction, and institutional consistency. The personal disappears into the administrative. This was a choice. Someone chose to intervene rather than allow divergence. Someone decided that the risk of visible disagreement outweighed the cost of internal suppression. And someone authorized the transformation of a family fortune into a governed entity designed to outlast personalities. The injustice does not reside in the desire for stability alone. It resides in how stability was achieved, authority was exercised without confrontation, consent was rendered unnecessary, beneficiaries were preserved financially while being neutralized structurally, Power was no longer something one could inherit in full. It was something that could be withheld indefinitely. From this point forward, silence became operational. Trustees no longer acted as intermediaries among equals. They acted as executors of a unified will. Council no longer balanced interests. They enforced coherence. And the public record, stripped of conflict, reflected only continuity. What remains visible is the estate itself, caecuate, orderly and enduring. What remains invisible is the moment when governance replaced inheritance, when a decision made in private redirected the future of an entire fortune. The next question is not whether this intervention succeeded. It did. The question is what had to be altered, removed, or erased. In the records to make that success appear natural, what disappeared so completely that only its absence can now be traced, in files that align too neatly, decisions that read too similarly, and instructions that no longer carry a name. By June 28, 1918, the intervention that had begun in private meetings and dispersed instructions entered its most consequential phase: alteration. Not alteration in rhetoric or intention, but alteration in the real operational world where control is exercised. This was the point at which governance stopped being a posture and became a mechanism. The changes did not arrive as a single decree. They appeared as revisions, reclassifications, and technical refinements that moved authority away from people and into structure. Rights that once traveled together, income, vote, appointment, veto, were separated and reassigned across layers of trusts, holding entities and committee approvals. Ownership remained visible. Command did not. On paper, nothing was. Confiscated. In practice, everything that mattered was relocated. The legal work behind this shift was precise. Elite counsel, including Sullivan and Cromwell, operated not as architects of conflict, but as engineers of permanence. Their role was not to argue for removal, but to draft continuity so thorough that removal no longer needed to be named. Clauses governing control were revised to emphasize process over discretion. Signatures were standardized, proxies were normalized. Voting authority was channeled through pre-approved pathways that no longer required direct participation by the beneficiary. The action of power here was reassignment. Decision rights were reassigned upward into trust committees. Veto capacity was reassigned sideways into conditional approvals. Appointment authority was reassigned inward, governed by eligibility standards that only trustees could interpret. Each change, considered alone, appeared administrative. Together, they constituted a transfer of command. The consequence was immediate and durable. Edith Rockefeller McCormick continued to receive distributions. Her financial position remained intact. But the instruments that allow an owner to shape the future of an estate, votes, appointments, strategic direction, were restricted, altered, and sealed into procedure. Control ceased to be a human decision and became a mechanical outcome. This mattered because it eliminated the possibility of challenge. When power resides in people, it can be contested. When power resides in clauses, it becomes self-executing. A beneficiary cannot argue with a committee standard. She cannot negotiate with a proxy rule. She cannot confront an eligibility requirement that has already been satisfied elsewhere. The system does not respond to dissent. It processes it. The records from this period reflect that transformation. Language that once referenced judgment begins referencing compliance. Decisions are no longer justified by preference or rationale, but by alignment with prior approvals. Trustees no longer explain why something was done. They note that it was done according to form. What was altered then was not simply documentation, it was the locus of ownership itself. The heir retained economic benefit, but lost authorship. The fortune no longer belonged to a person in any meaningful operational sense. It belonged to a structure that could persist without consent, without dialogue, and without visibility. This alteration also insulated those who benefited from accountability. When authority is distributed across clauses and committees, no single actor appears responsible. Council drafts, trustees execute, committees approve. Each role is limited. Together, they are absolute. Silence becomes shared. Responsibility dissolves into procedure. The injustice here is not symbolic. It is functional. A system was deliberately redesigned so that the appearance of inheritance could coexist with the reality of exclusion. The beneficiary was preserved as a recipient while being neutralized as an agent. Control was not denied, it was made unreachable. And because the changes were technical, they attracted no public attention. There were no headlines about reclassified votes, no editorials about standardized proxies, no scrutiny of committee thresholds. The press continued to report philanthropy. The public continued to associate the name with continuity. The mechanism operated beneath notice. By the end of June 1918, the transformation was complete. The Rockefeller fortune no longer required agreement to function. It no longer required unity to appear unified. It had been converted into an institution that could manage itself, insulated from individual will. The lingering question is not whether Edith Rockefeller McCormick still owned wealth. She did. The question is whether ownership without control can still be called ownership at all. When command migrates fully into clauses, when decision becomes automatic, and when power executes itself without a voice, the distinction between heir and structure collapses. The file closes on a revised clause, initialed, cross-referenced and approved, ink dry, margins clean, leaving behind a system that no longer needs a person to decide, only a process to continue. The alteration did not end with revised clauses and standardized proxies. Those were the visible endpoints, the final expressions of a process that continued to refine itself after June 28, 1918. Once control had been successfully transferred into structure, the system began doing what it was designed to do, reinforce its own legitimacy through repetition. Subsequent records show an increasing reliance on committee pathways as the default mode of decision-making. Matters that once might have required consultation with beneficiaries were routed instead through predefined approval sequences. Language hardened. Where earlier documents still acknowledged discretion, later ones referred only to thresholds, requirements, and precedent. The human element did not disappear suddenly. It faded, replaced by reference to prior determinations and existing frameworks. This mattered because it changed the meaning of objection. Any attempt to question an outcome could now be dismissed not as dissent, but as misunderstanding. The answer to challenge was no longer justification, but citation. Trustees did not argue their authority, they pointed to it. Council did not defend decisions. They referenced compliance. The system spoke in its own voice. For Edith Rockefeller McCormick, this meant that exclusion became procedural rather than personal. There was no single moment she could confront, no signature she could refuse without consequence. Each individual change was minor enough to appear reasonable. Taken together, they formed an enclosure. Control was not taken away in one act. It was redistributed so completely that retrieval became impossible. The consequence extended beyond governance into memory. Over time, records began to reflect the altered reality as if it had always existed. Earlier arrangements faded from relevance. New baselines were established. When future administrators reviewed the files, they encountered a system that appeared coherent, intentional, and settled. The question of how it arrived there was no longer present in the paperwork. This is how alteration becomes permanence. Once authority is embedded in mechanism, it outlives the context that justified it. The reasons for intervention, fear of exposure, risk of dispute, pressure from scrutiny, no longer need to be recalled. The structure continues without explanation. What began as a response becomes tradition. What began as containment becomes normal operation. The injustice persists precisely because it no longer announces itself. There is no ongoing act to protest. There is only an inherited framework that treats exclusion as neutral and silence as stability. The beneficiaries' continued income becomes evidence of fairness, even as the absence of agency remains unacknowledged. What these records ultimately reveal is not a single moment of wrongdoing, but a method. Power was altered in such a way that it ceased to appear as power at all. It became routine, it became technical, it became invisible, and invisibility is the final safeguard. By the time the system reached this stage, reversal would have required something extraordinary: public exposure, legal confrontation, or reputational risk severe enough to justify disruption. None of those occurred. The architecture held, the fortune endured, the structure proved stronger than the individual it was built around. What remains now is a pattern that invites comparison rather than closure. When control is moved into clauses, when authority is expressed through committees, and when ownership is reduced to receipt without voice, the line between inheritance and seizure becomes difficult to draw, unless one follows the record backward through revisions, proxies, and approvals to the moment when control stopped being exercised by a person and started being executed by design. The next trace does not ask what was changed, but who ultimately gained from a system that learned how to function without dissent, without revision, and without memory. By January 10, 1919, the benefits of silence had become measurable. Not in public statements or celebratory announcements, but in the internal stability of those positioned closest to the machinery of control. The alteration of authority was no longer a transition, it had settled into advantage. The primary beneficiaries were not individual heirs, they were the permanent trustees and the administrative nucleus that governed the estate's moving parts. With autonomy neutralized and discretion standardized, their role expanded without requiring expansion in title. Power did not need to be claimed when it was already embedded in procedure. What had once required negotiation now required only execution. This advantage was structural. Trustees whose positions were designed to be continuous now operated in an environment free from internal challenge. They were no longer balancing competing interests among beneficiaries. They were maintaining coherence. The absence of dissent reduced exposure, reduced liability, and reduced the need for justification. Decisions could be made quietly, consistently, and with institutional backing rather than personal risk. The Rockefeller Foundation emerged from this configuration with strengthened authority. Its operations benefited directly from the predictability that the new governance model produced. Funding schedules stabilized. Strategic direction could be planned years in advance without interruption from family dispute. Public-facing philanthropy gained credibility precisely because it appeared insulated from private conflict. Stability became evidence of virtue. The action of power in this phase was consolidation. Governance was consolidated across institutions that shared trustees, council, and administrative norms. Decision-making authority was reassigned upward into bodies that were structurally protected from individual will. Beneficiaries remained present but irrelevant to outcome. Their role was no longer to influence direction, only to receive distributions consistent with established terms. The consequence was institutional continuity by design. The estate could function indefinitely without revisiting questions of consent or leadership. Family conflict, once a human problem, was reclassified as a governance risk, something to be prevented rather than resolved. Silence was no longer a temporary condition, it was a requirement of stability. This shift carried moral weight because it inverted the logic of inheritance. The fortune no longer existed to serve its heirs. The heirs existed to validate the continuity of the fortune. Their presence provided legitimacy. Their absence of authority ensured efficiency. What appeared externally as harmony was, internally, the result of removal. Those who benefited most were those least visible. Trustees gained operational freedom without public accountability. Administrators gained clarity without opposition. Institutions gained permanence without scrutiny. No single actor could be identified as having taken control, because control no longer appeared as an act. It appeared as order. For Edith Rockefeller McCormick, the contrast was stark. Her loss was not financial, it was positional. She remained associated with the fortune in name and income, but she no longer shaped its future. The system did not require her silence to function, it required her irrelevance. And irrelevance leaves no record of resistance. What makes this phase difficult to challenge is its plausibility. Every outcome could be defended as prudent. Every restriction could be framed as protective. Every consolidation could be justified as necessary for institutional health. The beneficiaries' continued wealth served as proof that no injustice had occurred, even as agency had been removed entirely. The records from early 1919 reflect this confidence. Language becomes assured. References to risk diminish. Governance is no longer tentative, it is assumed. Trustees speak of continuity as a given. Institutions project longevity. The machinery no longer adjusts itself, it runs. The injustice persists because it no longer looks like injustice. It looks like success. The Rockefeller Foundation thrives, the estate remains intact, public confidence is reinforced, and the mechanisms that produce this outcome disappear into normalcy. This is the reward of silence, power that no longer needs to announce itself, control that no longer needs to be defended, authority that no longer belongs to a person and therefore cannot be confronted. The tension that remains unresolved is not who benefited in 1919. That is clear. The question that follows is what had to vanish for this benefit to become permanent. What names, rights, or lines of record were allowed to fade so completely that the structure could present itself as the natural order, rather than the result of a deliberate and one-sided reallocation. The next trace does not point to gain, but to absence, to what stopped appearing once the beneficiaries of silence no longer needed to justify themselves. The advantage conferred by this arrangement did not remain. Abstract. As 1919 progressed, its effects surfaced in the rhythms of governance itself. Meetings shortened, decisions accelerated. What once required careful calibration among multiple interests now moved through predetermined channels. The absence of friction was not incidental, it was the payoff. Institutional actors learned quickly that predictability bred authority. Trustees, operating without fear of reversal, began to plan beyond the immediate horizon. Policies could be drafted with the assumption of continuity. Long-term commitments no longer carried the risk of being contested by a beneficiary asserting independent judgment. The future became administratively safe. This safety translated into leverage. Institutions associated with the Rockefeller fortune, charitable, educational, and administrative, were able to negotiate externally from a position of apparent unity. Partners encountered a single voice. Regulators encountered consistency. The press encountered stability. What had once been a family with internal dynamics, now appeared as a coherent entity with institutional intent. The beneficiaries of this shift did not need to speak publicly to enjoy its effects. Their authority was expressed through absence rather than presence. They did not need to intervene because the system intervened on their behalf. Governance operated as a buffer, absorbing potential challenges before they could materialize. For individual heirs, this environment narrowed the meaning of participation. Their continued inclusion in financial flows became a substitute for involvement. Receipt replaced authorship. Over time, this distinction hardened. To question outcomes was to question the structure itself, an act that now carried reputational and legal risk without any corresponding avenue for success. This is how benefit compounds, not through accumulation of wealth alone, but through the elimination of variables. The fewer voices that can alter direction, the more confidently an institution can project permanence. Silence becomes not merely tolerated, but productive. The system also learned how to narrate itself. Stability was presented as virtue. Continuity was framed as stewardship. The absence of conflict was offered as evidence of good governance rather than as the result of containment. Over time, even internal records reflected this reframing. Language ceased to acknowledge beneficiaries as potential actors. They were referenced as conditions to be managed, rather than participants to be consulted. The moral imbalance deepened because the outcome appeared benign. No one was publicly harmed. No fortunes were visibly taken. No disputes reached court. The beneficiary's material comfort served as proof that the arrangement was fair. What went unmeasured was the cost of exclusion, a cost that left no invoice and generated no headline. What emerges from this phase is a pattern that extends beyond one family. When institutions are allowed to treat internal dissent as risk, and when governance structures are empowered to neutralize that risk without accountability, benefit accrues to those who administer the system rather than those it ostensibly serves. Authority migrates toward permanence, away from personhood. By the time this configuration solidified, its beneficiaries no longer needed to defend it. The structure had learned to justify itself. Any attempt to revisit the original imbalance would appear destabilizing, even irresponsible. The longer the silence held, the stronger the claim that silence was necessary. This is the quiet reward embedded in administrative power, the ability to convert an initial intervention into an enduring advantage, and then to present that advantage as the natural state of affairs. What remains unresolved is not the identity of those who benefited. That has already become clear. What remains unresolved is how many subsequent decisions, commitments, and public narratives were built atop an arrangement that depended on one person's diminished agency, and how thoroughly that dependency was erased from memory. The record continues forward without acknowledging this foundation, leaving behind a system that prospers precisely because it no longer needs to remember the conditions under which it was secured. On April 22, 1919, the record did not change in what it said. It changed in what it stopped saying. The disappearance was not announced, logged, or justified. It was inferred through absence, through breaks in sequence, through references that no longer resolved into content. What vanished were not assets or titles, but traces of objection, signals that dissent had once existed. Earlier correspondence hinted at friction. Phrases appeared without follow-up. Mentions of concern pointed to letters that were never attached. Cross-references led nowhere. In the ordinary flow of estate documentation, this kind of incompleteness was unusual. Files were otherwise meticulous. Dates aligned, pages were numbered, annexes were accounted for, and yet here the paper trail thinned precisely where disagreement would have been expected to surface. This was not accidental loss. It followed a recognizable managerial logic. Frederick T. Gates, long associated with the Rockefeller system as an administrator who prioritized efficiency, coherence, and insulation from risk, operated within a framework that treated documentation as a tool rather than a record of truth. Not everything written needed to be preserved. Not everything preserved needed to be shared. The distinction between what existed and what entered the official estate record was not neutral. It was governed. The action of power at this stage was a mission. Letters were retained privately or discarded routinely. Memoranda were acknowledged but not archived. References to objections were stripped of their substance, leaving behind placeholders without content. The estate record did not deny dissent. It simply failed to contain it. The consequence was irreversible. Without documents, there could be no dispute. Without attachments, there could be no review. Without signatures preserved in context, there could be no reconstruction of intent. What remained was only outcome, a governance structure operating as if no resistance had ever been offered. This disappearance mattered because it finalized the transformation of control. Up to this point, authority had been altered, consolidated, and normalized. But dissent, even if neutralized, still left a trace. Once those traces were removed from the shared record, the system no longer needed to defend itself. There was nothing left to answer. For Edith Rockefeller McCormick, this meant that even the possibility of historical recognition evaporated. Her objections, if made, did not become part of the archive. Her resistance, if expressed, did not survive as evidence. The record no longer reflected a contested process, only a settled one. In the absence of documentation, exclusion appeared consensual by default. This is the quietest form of erasure, not denial, but non-retention, not censorship, but curation. The system did not destroy documents in a dramatic purge. It filtered them out of relevance. What was not necessary for continuity was treated as surplus. What threatened coherence was treated as private. The injustice here deepens because it operates retroactively. Once dissent disappears from the record, the past itself is altered. Future administrators reviewing the files encounter no sign of conflict. They see alignment where there was tension, agreement where there was resistance. The structure appears to have emerged organically, without opposition. And because the erasure is procedural, it leaves no villain behind. No single act can be identified as suppression. Each omission can be justified as routine. Each missing attachment can be explained as administrative discretion. Responsibility dissolves into process. The record from April 1919 onward reflects this cleansing. Language becomes smoother, references become self-contained, decisions no longer allude to alternative views. The archive begins to speak with one voice, not because only one voice existed, but because only one was preserved. What disappears is not merely paper, it is authorship. Without objection recorded, authority appears unchallenged. Without dissent acknowledged, control appears legitimate. The beneficiary's loss of agency becomes invisible, reframed as acquiescence rather than exclusion. This absence also protects those who benefited. Trustees, administrators, and institutions no longer need to justify their positions against a documented challenge. There is no counter-narrative to address. The past is settled by default. By removing objection from the record, the system ensured that the injustice could never be fully reconstructed from within its own files. Anyone seeking explanation would find continuity, not conflict, stability, not struggle, governance, not coercion. The result is a legacy that cannot explain itself, because the materials required for explanation were never retained together. What remains is an inheritance without permission and without visible author, A fortune that functions smoothly precisely because the moments of resistance that shaped it were allowed to fade. The image left behind is not dramatic. It is a folder with clean margins, sequential pages, and no letters where letters should be. A complete archive that feels finished, and a silence so thorough that it raises a final, unresolved tension. If dissent once existed and now cannot be found, what else may have been removed to ensure that this story could only be told one way? The disappearance did more than cleanse the archive. It reshaped how legitimacy would be inferred going forward. Once objections no longer appeared in the shared record, every subsequent decision inherited a presumption of consensus. Silence became evidence. Absence functioned as approval. The system did not need to assert that dissent was resolved. It behaved as if dissent had never occurred. This shift altered how administrators interacted with the past. When earlier files no longer reflected resistance, later memoranda could cite established practice without qualification. References to continuity required no footnotes. The record became self-validating. What could not be found did not need to be addressed, and what did not need to be addressed ceased to matter. Operationally, this produced a narrowing of memory. Decisions were anchored to the most recent clean layer of documentation, not to the contested layers beneath it. Administrators learned which materials circulated safely and which did not. Over time, the archive trained its own custodians. They did not need explicit instruction to omit. They absorbed the pattern. For an individual seeking to reconstruct intent, this created a dead end. The chain of causation broke precisely where motive would have been articulated. References existed without attachments. Citations pointed to files no longer present in the official sequence. The absence was not chaotic. It was consistent. The same kinds of materials failed to appear across different sets of records, suggesting not neglect but selection. This mattered because it severed accountability from outcome. Without preserved objections, no one could be said to have overridden them. Without preserved alternatives, no one could be said to have rejected them. Authority appeared to flow naturally into its final configuration, untroubled by conflict. The system did not deny choice. It removed evidence that choice had ever been contested. The practical consequence was the hardening of governance into inevitability. Later, administrators did not see themselves as enforcing a controversial settlement. They saw themselves as maintaining an inherited order. Responsibility shifted from decision to stewardship. Each generation of managers inherited not only the structure, but the silence that justified it. For Edith Rockefeller McCormick, this meant that even retrospective redress became implausible. Without documentation, there was no basis for review. Without review, there was no remedy. The record could not support a claim because it no longer acknowledged the conditions that would make a claim intelligible. Loss of agency became indistinguishable from choice not to act. The injustice persists here because it is cumulative. Each omission reinforces the next. Each clean page validates the absence of the previous one. Over time, the archive no longer reflects a process. It reflects a conclusion, and conclusions resist reopening. What makes this erasure durable is that it does not require ongoing suppression. Once the materials are gone from the shared record, the system can operate transparently within its own terms. It can publish, it can disclose, it can invite scrutiny, confident that scrutiny will encounter only what has been preserved. This is the quiet efficiency of administrative power. It does not need to falsify, it only needs to curate. And curation, when consistent, becomes indistinguishable from truth. The tension left unresolved is not whether dissent occurred. The gaps imply that it did. The tension is whether a system that removes its own points of contradiction can ever be asked to account for them. When the archive presents unanimity as history, the burden shifts to the absent, to those whose voices were not retained. What remains at the end of this sequence is a complete file that feels incomplete only to those who know where to look. Pages align, numbers match, references close neatly on themselves. And yet somewhere between those clean margins, a set of objections once existed that never became part of the story the record was allowed to tell. On August 19, 1919, the record breaks its own rhythm. The inconsistency does not announce itself loudly. It appears as a detail that resists alignment, a small fracture in an otherwise disciplined sequence. The date matters because by this point, the system had already learned how to present coherence. Deviations this late are not casual. They survive only when something fails to seal completely. The inconsistency emerges in a signature sequence that does not match the surrounding entries. The name appears in a position it should not occupy, attached to an instrument that, according to the chronology established elsewhere in the file, should already have been finalized. The handwriting aligns with earlier documents, but the timing does not. The signature surfaces after authority has supposedly been settled, after control has been redistributed, after dissent has vanished from the record. It arrives too late to be procedural and too precise to be accidental. Alongside this anomaly sits a second irregularity. A copy filed replaces what should have been the original. The language notes compliance, but the physical reality does not follow. Annex numbers shift, pagination restarts, references that once pointed forward now point backward. The document claims continuity, yet the filing sequence suggests substitution. This is not how clean administration behaves, it is how correction behaves when it must appear as routine. The action of power here is alteration through replacement. An original document is omitted from the accessible chain and replaced by a derivative version whose presence resolves a problem created elsewhere. The substitution does not erase authority outright, it recalibrates it. The revised record supports the outcome already in force, not the process that led there. The consequence is destabilizing for the official narrative. If inheritance had followed a natural order, there would be no need for late-stage alignment. If control had passed smoothly, signatures would fall where expected. The appearance of a corrected document after the fact suggests that something earlier did not hold. It suggests that the record needed reinforcement. This inconsistency matters because it reintroduces agency where the archive has otherwise worked to remove it. A correction implies choice. A substitution implies discretion. And discretion implies that the system was not merely executing inevitability, but responding to vulnerability. Something in the earlier structure left room for challenge, and that room had to be closed. What makes this detail dangerous is not its size, but its implication. One misaligned signature undermines the claim that authority transferred seamlessly. One renumbered annex undermines the idea that governance evolved organically. These are the kinds of errors that survive when the record has been edited for outcome rather than preserved for accuracy. The beneficiary harmed by this inconsistency is the same one harmed throughout, the individual whose authority was removed without visible consent. The record now suggests that consent may not have been as complete as later documents imply. The late appearance of alignment hints that something resisted, however briefly, and that resistance required management. Administratively, the response was containment. The corrected filing does not draw attention to itself. It resolves quietly into the sequence. No explanatory memo accompanies it. No cross-reference acknowledges the change. The system absorbs the inconsistency rather than confronting it. The goal is not transparency, it is closure. This pattern aligns with what has already been observed. When objection cannot be answered, it is omitted. When omission leaves a gap, the gap is filled retroactively. When retroactive filling risks exposure, it is framed as clerical. The archive becomes less a mirror of events and more a device to stabilize them. The risk, had this inconsistency been noticed at the time, would have been significant. A contested signature or altered annex could invite review. Review could invite scrutiny. Scrutiny could reopen questions of authority that the system had worked carefully to seal. In a post-Standard Oil environment still sensitive to appearances of centralized control, that scrutiny would not have remained internal. It could have reached courts, regulators, or the press. That risk explains why the inconsistency survives only in trace form. It is visible enough to register, but not enough to explain itself. The original context that would make it legible has already disappeared. Letters that might clarify intent are not present. Drafts that might show revision are not attached. The contradiction stands alone, stripped of the materials that would resolve it. This is where the investigative thread tightens. The inconsistency does not prove wrongdoing by itself, but it contradicts the claim of inevitability. It suggests that the outcome required maintenance, and maintenance implies that the structure was not as stable as it later appeared. From this point forward, the record resumes its discipline. Signatures align, annexes follow sequence, language smooths out, the system closes ranks around the corrected version. The inconsistency is not repeated, it is absorbed and forgotten, yet it remains. One date that does not fit, one filing that arrives too late, one correction that implies an earlier problem. In an archive otherwise designed to eliminate friction, this detail functions as the only honest line, because it refuses to fully comply. The unresolved tension is not whether this was a mistake, it is whether mistakes are the only moments when engineered systems reveal themselves. If every other line has been curated for stability, then contradiction becomes the sole surviving witness to a process that was never meant to be seen. The image left at the end of this block is precise and unsettling. A typed page, stamped copy filed, dated August 19, 1919, its annex number slightly out of sequence, resting in a folder that otherwise closes perfectly. One document misaligned, asking whether the order it supports was ever as natural as the record insists. On October 5, 1919, the danger was no longer theoretical inside the record. It became definable as a cost, the kind of cost that institutions learn to measure with precision. By this point, the governance structure had stabilized, dissent had been filtered out of the official file, and even the late inconsistency had been absorbed through administrative substitution. The system had done what it was built to do. The remaining threat was not legal collapse. It was exposure. If the internal architecture behind Edith Rockefeller McCormick's loss of authority had come to light in 1919, the story would not have been framed as an orderly inheritance. It would have read as a legal takeover executed under the language of stewardship. The difference is not semantic. In that era, inheritance implied continuity and legitimacy. Takeover implied intent, maneuver, and power consolidating itself behind a closed door. The press would have had an obvious headline, not because journalists needed to invent one, but because the period was primed for it. The nation had spent the previous decade learning to distrust private power that claimed to be benign. The dissolution of Standard Oil in 1911 had taught readers that the most stable institutions could be legally judged as threats. After that ruling, the Rockefeller name carried a permanent duality. philanthropy on the surface, monopoly memory underneath. A leak in 1919 would have reopened that duality in a new form. The risk was not merely embarrassment, it was narrative inversion. Philanthropic stability would have been reinterpreted as the product of controlled silence rather than public virtue. Governance would have been reinterpreted as containment, and the beneficiaries' continued income, used internally as proof of fairness, would have been reframed as a quiet payoff, designed to prevent contestation. The injustice would not have needed to be proven through emotional argument. The documents would have done it. The concrete counterfactual is simple and plausible. A draft term sheet, a minute, or a memorandum describing voting control, leaked not as a full archive, but as a fragment. One page is enough when it contradicts the official story. A single reference to irrevocable authority, a clause assigning decision rights to a committee, a line describing the beneficiary's role as passive. Those details would have traveled faster than any official denial. The action of power in response to that risk would have been containment and purchase. Silence is not always enforced through threat. Often it is secured through transaction, through settlement, through private assurances that convert a problem into a manageable expense. The system would have treated the leak not as a moral crisis, but as a reputational breach requiring closure. The objective would not have been to explain. It would have been to end circulation. The consequences of public exposure would have extended beyond one family dispute. Rivals and critics would have had an instrument to attack Rockefeller legitimacy in the broader arena of influence. In the philanthropic and institutional landscape, partnerships depend on perceived integrity. Universities, hospitals, and civic organizations accept funding partly because it appears insulated from coercion. A revelation that the fortune was governed through legal suppression of an heir would have contaminated that perception. It would have made every grant look like leverage. Economic alliances would have become vulnerable. Competitors and political adversaries could have framed Rockefeller influence as a continuation of private power by other means. No longer monopoly through oil, but monopoly through governance. The argument would have been easy to assemble. If a family can neutralize internal dissent through legal architecture, it can neutralize external resistance through the same administrative logic. The question would not have been whether the Rockefellers gave money. It would have been what that money controlled. Market and political pressure would have followed. By 1919, regulatory attention did not need new laws to become aggressive. It needed public suspicion. Public suspicion invites inquiry. Inquiry invites hearings. Hearings invite documents. And documents invite the kind of forced disclosure that private archives are designed to avoid. The system's greatest fear was not being judged in court on a single clause. It was being forced into sunlight where the total pattern could be seen. This is why silence was cheaper than truth. The real cost of exposure would not have been paid only by trustees. It would have been paid by institutions built on the appearance of stability. The Rockefeller Foundation, strengthened by predictability, would have faced questions about governance, about independence, about whether philanthropic direction was truly public-minded or merely administratively coherent. Once that question enters circulation, stability stops functioning as proof of legitimacy. It becomes proof of control. Edith Rockefeller McCormick's position would have shifted instantly in the public imagination. She would no longer appear as a beneficiary within a settled legacy. She would appear as a removed authority, kept financially comfortable while being structurally excluded. And that reframing would have made it harder to dismiss her absence from governance as voluntary. The system's careful design, income preserved, agency removed, would have been recognized for what it was: a method of preventing contestation without creating visible conflict. This is the risk the record is built to avoid, not the existence of documents, but the interpretation of them. The same clause that reads as prudence internally reads as seizure externally when the beneficiary is real, and the loss of authority is clear. And because the loss occurred without open dispute, the public would have asked the only question that matters in a case like this. If it was legitimate, why was it hidden? The record's late inconsistencies now look different under this light. A copy filed is not harmless if it appears after the fact. A shifted annex number is not clerical if it closes an opening. A missing letter is not routine if it would have explained a contested signature. Each irregularity becomes a potential pressure point, something a journalist or investigator could pull until the entire structure starts to show strain. On October 5th, 1919, the cost-benefit logic would have been clear to anyone managing the empire. The reputational damage of truth, once it became a public story, would exceed the internal cost of securing compliance. Buying silence, maintaining alignment, and preventing a leak would have been treated as governance expenses, no different in function than legal fees or administrative overhead. Truth was not rejected because it was false. It was rejected because it was unaffordable. The block ends with a concrete image because that is where the risk becomes real. A thin, unsigned draft term sheet dated October 5th, 1919, folded once and slipped into a private envelope. Paper light enough to disappear, but heavy enough that if it had reached the wrong desk, the entire narrative of inheritance could have collapsed into a single word: takeover. By 1920, the most important change was not what the Rockefeller system did, but how it began to describe what it did. The language shifted first, and once the language shifted, the behavior could repeat without needing to justify itself each time. In the files that survive from this turn of habit, the vocabulary becomes consistently vague. Actions that would have sounded aggressive in plain speech are recorded instead as restricted, preservation, administrative, family privacy, and governance. These words do not deny power. They neutralize its appearance. They turn interventions into maintenance and removals into policy. They allow a control decision to be treated as a clerical consequence of procedure. This matters because the system had already learned the cost of exposure. The late 1919 inconsistencies showed that even a well-designed archive could develop stress fractures. The response in 1920 was not to hide harder, but to standardize the conditions under which things could be seen. Secrecy ceased to be an exceptional act used in moments of danger. It became a protocol applied routinely, even when no crisis was visible. The action of power here was institutionalization. Policies were formalized around who could access what, who could circulate copies, and what material could exist in more than one location. Committees became the default pathways for decisions, not because committees are inherently more thoughtful, but because committees diffuse responsibility. An outcome can be attributed to process rather than to a person. When a beneficiary's request is denied, it is not denied by an individual. It is not approved. The record is not a refusal, it is a classification. The effect is subtle and devastating. Once denial is framed as classification, the system no longer needs to argue, it only needs to sort. In 1920, access begins to look like a ladder with controlled rungs. Some materials are designated for trustees only, some for council, some for committee review, some for circulation under limited conditions. Copies are marked, copies are tracked, copies are summarized instead of shared. Originals are retained for preservation. The language suggests care, but the function is control. The archive does not disappear, it stratifies. This stratification changed the experience of anyone who was not part of the governing nucleus. Edith Rockefeller McCormick remained an heir in public form, but in operational terms she became an outsider to the machinery that governed what she ostensibly owned. If she asked for documents, she could be told that the matter was administrative. If she asked for explanations, she could be told that family privacy required restraint. If she asked to intervene, she could be told that governance standards restricted discretionary involvement. Each answer would sound reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a closed system. The consequence was that abuse became normality. Once secrecy is formalized into policy, it no longer feels like secrecy to those executing it. It feels like compliance. Clerks follow protocols, trustees follow committee procedures, council follow access rules. No one needs to believe they are suppressing anything. They believe they are preserving order. This is how extraordinary acts become routine without ever being admitted as extraordinary. The record reflects this normalization through repetition. The same terms recur. The same cautious phrasing appears across unrelated topics. Decisions are documented as outcomes of process rather than acts of authority. A beneficiary's role is reduced to being informed, not consulted. The system does not need to silence anyone in dramatic fashion because it has created a world where speaking changes nothing. The levers are elsewhere. Even the circulation of information becomes controlled in a way that mimics legitimacy. Partial summaries replace full documents. Excerpted references replace attachments. A page is described rather than provided. When something is questioned, the response is not confrontation, but deferral, committee review, council verification, preservation requirements. Time becomes a tool of governance. Delays become normal. And what is delayed long enough becomes irrelevant. The moral weight of this phase lies in its calmness. By 1920, there is no longer an emergency driving these choices. The system is not reacting, it is maintaining, and maintenance is harder to challenge than reaction because it is framed as responsible. A protest against maintenance sounds like instability. A demand for openness sounds like recklessness. The structure has inverted the burden of proof. Transparency must justify itself, while restriction appears self-evident. This is why the injustice could endure without needing continuous enforcement. The system no longer relied on active concealment. It relied on classification. Once a document is restricted, it does not need to be destroyed. Once an objection is not circulated, it does not need to be refuted. Once an outcome is administrative, it does not need to be debated. By 1920, silence had become routine because it no longer required a decision. It required only adherence to a protocol that had been designed to outlast those who designed it. The unresolved tension moving into the next phase is not whether secrecy existed, it is whether anyone inside the system could still recognize it as secrecy. When power is exercised through committees and access ladders, the mechanism stops feeling like concealment and starts feeling like normal governance. And when concealment feels normal, the archive can remain full while the truth remains inaccessible. The image left at the end is plain and clinical. A file jacket dated 1920, stamped "restricted for governance use," with a circulation log clipped inside, names, initials and dates, showing not what was hidden, but how effortlessly hiding became procedure. By May 12th, 1935, the Rockefeller legacy looked finished, not merely stable, but resolved, packaged into a public narrative of order, philanthropy, permanence, and what newspapers and institutional partners could comfortably call responsible inheritance. The timing matters because 1935 sits deep into the era when wealth, once openly defended as private right, had to be defended as public usefulness. The country had passed through war, then upheaval, then the long shock of the Great Depression. In that environment, large fortunes survived not by insisting on innocence, but by performing stewardship. And stewardship requires a story the public can accept. By 1935, that story was clean. The Rockefeller name appeared attached to universities, hospitals, research, and civic stability. The Rockefeller Foundation stood as a symbol of organized benevolence, with administrative calm that suggested maturity rather than power. The visible legacy was not a family arguing over control. It was an institution practicing continuity. This is what the public inherited, an image of disciplined governance and measured generosity, a dynasty that had apparently learned to convert wealth into public benefit without scandal. But the records, where they survive, suggest that the story was not simply told, it was maintained. The action of power in this phase was selective preservation. Files were kept, but not evenly. The archive did not disappear, it curated itself. Materials that reinforced the narrative of continuity remained accessible, referenced, and repeated. Materials that would expose control as a choice rather than as an administrative inevitability were restricted, omitted, or preserved outside the official estate record. The system did not need to invent facts. It needed only to decide which facts would be visible. The consequence was enduring asymmetry. The public received a version of the legacy that made governance look natural and conflict look absent. Meanwhile, heirs inherited limits that could not be fully explained in the same public language. Beneficiaries could still receive income, still appear in society, still be associated with the name, but the steering wheel remained elsewhere, embedded in committees, proxies, and clauses that had long since been normalized as procedure. This is the unresolved element that 1935 cannot explain, why control appears in the record as a clause and not as a decision. Clauses do not admit motive. They do not confess intervention. They do not show who wanted what and why. They present authority as structure and structure as necessity. In the official narrative, no one took power. Power simply rested where governance required it. But governance does not form itself. The absence of clear choice is itself the artifact. When an heir cannot be found in the chain of operational authority, when decision-making moves through committees whose membership is stable across decades, when veto capacity is defined by eligibility standards rather than by personhood, the question becomes unavoidable. How did the system arrive there without being openly contested? By 1935, the answer was no longer recoverable from the public record because the record had been trained not to hold it. Objections that might have clarified intent were not present. Drafts that might show how authority was negotiated were not attached. Originals that might contradict later copy-filed substitutions were not circulating. The archive preserved results, not conflicts. It preserved continuity, not the cost of achieving it. This is why the public narrative remains persuasive. It contains no visible coercion. It contains no visible theft. It contains no visible rupture. The story of responsible inheritance is easier to believe when the archive no longer contains the materials that would make it complicated. And yet, the consequences of the earlier intervention persist into this later moment. Beneficiaries inherit a role that is financially secure, but structurally constrained. They receive distributions without authorship. They are included without being empowered. Their relationship to the fortune resembles membership in a system rather than ownership of one. That condition becomes generational. Children inherit not only wealth, but a governance architecture already in place, already self-justifying, already insulated from reversal. The moral weight of 1935 is that it reveals the success of the method. By this point, The system no longer needs crisis to justify restriction. Restriction is framed as maturity, privacy is framed as responsibility, governance is framed as protection, and the public, exhausted by instability, hungry for permanence, accepts the framing. This is not a conspiracy. It is a design principle. When large fortunes survive political and economic upheaval, they do so by making their internal mechanisms appear boring. The more boring the mechanism, the less likely it is to be questioned. The more administrative the language, the less likely it is to be interpreted as power. By 1935, power has learned to describe itself as routine. The injustice remains because it is no longer visible as injustice. The public inherits the official version, complete with clean lines of institutional purpose. The heirs inherit the limits, complete with clauses that cannot be argued with, committees that cannot be confronted, and archives that cannot fully explain how the limits came to be. And this is where the investigation tightens again. The legacy that remained is not just the fortune, it is the template, the ability to preserve an outcome while erasing the narrative of choice that produced it. The system does not need to hide in the way a guilty person hides. It only needs to classify, preserve selectively, and let time do the rest. The block ends with a concrete image, because that is what survives when motive does not. A public annual report dated May 12, 1935, its language calm and civic, resting on a polished table, while in a separate restricted file cabinet, the documents that would explain who lost the wheel remain locked behind a classification stamp that still refuses to speak. What makes May 12, 1935 so instructive is not the scale of the legacy, but the maturity of its presentation. By this point, the system no longer needed to defend itself against accusation because it had learned to eliminate the conditions under which accusation could form. The public record did not merely omit controversy. It redirected attention toward outputs, institutions funded, programs sustained, stability performed, until output became the only acceptable measure of legitimacy. This redirection had a predictable effect. When philanthropy becomes the visible face of a fortune, questions about internal authority begin to sound irrelevant, even improper. The public learns to judge governance by results rather than by structure. And once that habit takes hold, the mechanism behind the results becomes protected not by secrecy alone, but by social permission. Inquiry is reframed as cynicism. Doubt is reframed as disrespect for public benefit. That shift made selective archives extraordinarily powerful. A clean story did not require total concealment. It required a consistent filter. Records that demonstrated continuity were allowed to circulate as proof of responsibility. Records that showed control as engineered rather than inherited remained internal, where they could be treated as administrative detail rather than as moral evidence. Over time, the boundary between public-facing history and governance material hardened into a norm, as if it had always been obvious that the public should see outcomes, not mechanisms. For heirs, this created a quiet trap. Any attempt to reassert authority could be interpreted not as a rightful claim, but as a threat to the very stability the public had been trained to value. The question of who controls what became inseparable from the fear of what happens if control is challenged. In a decade shaped by instability, that fear carried real weight. The system did not need to coerce loudly. It could rely on the cultural preference for order. This is how limits become inheritable without ever being acknowledged as limits. A beneficiary does not receive a clear explanation of what was taken. They receive a framework in which the question itself is treated as disruptive. They inherit a structure that presents itself as protective. And because that structure is older than their adult memory, it appears not as a decision made against them, but as the natural architecture of the legacy. The moral asymmetry deepens because the system's success becomes its justification. As institutions expand, as public partnerships multiply, as civic language surrounds the fortune, the original transfer of authority recedes into irrelevance, except for those whose agency never returned. What began as an intervention to prevent contestation becomes a permanent condition that no longer needs to be explained, because explanation would imply that things could have been otherwise. But the surviving traces still imply that they were otherwise. The gap is not only historical, it is structural. When control is defined primarily through clauses, committees, and access policy, the human relationship between heir and legacy becomes secondary. Ownership is reduced to entitlement, while direction belongs to the mechanism. The legacy becomes something one belongs to, not something one commands. And once that transformation is complete, it is difficult to name as injustice because it produces no spectacle. It produces stability. It produces responsible inheritance. Yet responsibility without accountability is simply a more durable form of power. By 1935, the archive functions as the final guardian, not because it hides everything, but because it ensures that what can be seen will always support the same. Conclusion: the record does not need to lie. It only needs to be complete in the ways that matter for public belief, and incomplete in the ways that would threaten it. This leaves a final, unresolved tension moving forward. If the public learned the Rockefeller story through curated outputs, and heirs learned it through inherited limits, where does the truth reside? Inside the mechanism that still operates, or in the missing chain of choices that made it operate that way in the first place? The image that remains is quiet and contemporary for its time, a neatly bound institutional report placed on a shelf for public viewing, while a separate index card, unremarkable, unquoted, stamped for internal governance, continues to decide what the official story is allowed to remember. By January 4th, 1947, enough years had passed for the story to harden into something the public could repeat without hesitation. The reports were bound, the language was settled, the institutions stood in daylight. And the mechanisms that shaped them had receded into the private architecture of trusts and council, into places where the ordinary citizen was never meant to look. What remained was a legacy that appeared complete. Order, permanence, philanthropy, responsible inheritance, each phrase polished by decades of repetition. Yet the surviving record, even in its careful silences, suggests a quieter truth. Inheritance is not the transfer of money. It is the transfer of governance. And governance, unlike cash, can be redirected without consent, secured by design and preserved by classification. A fortune can be left to an heir, while authority is left to a structure. This is the institutional moral the archive refuses to state plainly. Trusts do not merely protect wealth from outsiders. In practiced hands, they can also rewrite who is permitted to command it from within. They can turn an heir into a beneficiary, a voice into a signature, a family into an institution that no longer requires family. And once that transformation has been completed on paper, it becomes socially accepted as history, because history, too, is often a matter of what survives in the file. The elegant surface of dynasty stories has always relied on the same illusion, that power passes forward naturally, as if by blood or destiny. But the record suggests another lineage entirely, one made of annex numbers, proxy language, committee thresholds, copies filed, and doors that close before anyone outside. Governance learns what was decided inside. If that thought unsettles, it should, because in these halls the truth was not defeated in open court. It was stabilized, page by page, until it could no longer be named as conflict. A disagreement was treated as risk. A risk was treated as procedure, and procedure became the only authority left standing. The public inherited the clean version. The heirs inherited the limits. The institutions inherited the steering wheel, and yet the most enduring. Secrets are not the ones hidden by darkness. They are the ones filed under terms so reasonable no one thinks to question them. So if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the soft friction of paper against paper, the measured cadence of a clerk's stamp, the echo of a corridor after a door has closed. Somewhere, a folder is returned to a shelf, and the absence of a missing letter continues to function as a verdict. If you want to follow these records further, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens, remain with Beyond the Golden Halls. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And if this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. Because this is never only one family, or one fortune, or one decade. It is a method, a template, a way of placing authority behind clauses no one votes to remove, until the absence itself becomes tradition. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.